as we see everybody joining in, as their numbers are starting to wind their way up. So we'll just give it another just maybe 10 seconds or so, right? And then we'll start. Well, hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Bob Flanagan. I am a priest in the Diocese of New York and an adjunct faculty member at General Theological Seminary, a board member for a number of years at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and also coming up this semester will be the Dean Scholar at Virginia Seminary. And I'm delighted to introduce my panel and also open up with a prayer. And so why don't we start with a prayer, and then I'll introduce folks and we can give you an outline for the day. So as we are, the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. My Lord and my God, you glittered the night sky with stars and filled the dark depths of the ocean with life. Assist me to accept the ways of the world and my place in it. Help me understand my brain and its complexities. Comfort me when my mind is agitated and anxious, and support me when I am weak. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So let me quickly do the introduction. You're going to be very excited about the folks that are joining us today. So we have Jody Horstman, and a licensed clinical psychologist and clinical addiction counselor. Dr. Jody Horstman serves as Chief Integration Officer at Aspire, Indiana, a community mental health center and integrated health system in central Indiana. Dr. Horstman has worked within the community of mental health system since 1990 and also has extensive experience in community disaster mental health, having served in New York following 9/11 as part of the Indiana Task Force following Hurricane Katrina, and in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake. She's also a member of Indiana's State Disaster Mental Health Team and a trainer of psychological first aid. Her experiences led her to develop a greater appreciation and interest in resilience and well-being, so important, leading her to work for the past 10 years with the Episcopal Church Pension Group, also as a consultant for Credo, and providing seminars on resilience, work-life balance, psychological first aid, and related topics. We also have with us, how about Jody, why don't you wave or give a...
Everybody.
Yeah. Rachel Meyer is on a mission to develop and implement sustainable, holistic wellness programs for clergy and their congregations. She works as a program director for both the Clergy Health Initiative and the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke Divinity School. Joining Duke and CHI in 2012, Rachel's early work with the initiative focused on data collection and research on the holistic health of United Methodist clergy in North Carolina. In 2014, she shifted focus to help CHI develop new programs, as well as to translate the CHI's research findings to broader audiences. Through her leadership of TMC's program, the Reimagining Healthcare Collaborative, Rachel has worked with over 30 churches, helping them develop faithful responses to mental health needs, substance abuse disorders, and food access. Rachel also directs the annual Practice and Presence Conference, a gathering of Christians in mental health care. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Adele Walters is a licensed professional counselor. She has extensive experience working with adults on a wide range of issues, including anxiety, depression, grief, self-esteem, and relationships. As a clergy spouse, Adele is particularly interested in the emotional well-being of clergy, thank you, and their families, and has served on a network of therapists for Presbyterian clergy families in Arkansas, in addition to serving as Credo faculty and planning for wellness faculty for Episcopal clergy. She is also an active member of Calvary Episcopal Church in downtown Memphis, where her husband Scott is rector, and is currently serving as chair of the Commission on Ministry in the Diocese of Western Tennessee. She is also knee-deep in organizing the Partners Path, a national organization to connect and support spouses of Episcopal clergy. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
I'm going to let me outline for us a bit of what we all were thinking might work as a plan for today. So what we want to do is each of us will comment and kind of anecdotally and perhaps through our research of what we're seeing these days, meaning during the pandemic and all that's happening. We also want to take a few minutes. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to talk about their specialties and what they do in particular, because there's some fascinating programs that our panelists are leading. And then we want to look at ways that we can help the mental health of clergy's family and support staff, coping with everything that's going on. And then finally, I think we'll finish off with practical tips and perhaps some questions to ponder and a closing prayer. And if I can, my last of chatting on here, I would say that my beginning of this anecdote and why I think this is so important is a colleague friend of mine reached out to me the other day and asked me if I would lead a staff retreat for her and her staff, and I was thrilled to do so. And I said, well, what's going on? She basically said, listen, everybody's exhausted and overstressed, and can you give us some time of refreshment? And I think that's so many of us. I think that kind of, for me, really sums up where so many of the clergy are, that we've been working hard for the last year and a half, doing everything virtually, where we don't get, or so much of it's virtually, right? And we don't get that feedback we do when we're with our congregations in person. So that's what I'm seeing, and I think that it's an important time for us to pause and take self-care. But what do you all think?
So I'm going to echo that, Bob. When you first asked, what are we seeing? The first thing that came to mind is tired, exhausted, also sad, also angry sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, I've put that pattern in it. What I'm seeing is that the ground is shifting under everyone consistently. And as soon as you get your feet turned a certain direction, it shifts again. And then just when we're starting to get used to the shifting and to get used to the recalibrating, constant recalibrating, then by that time there's a pile of sadness, there's a pile of grief, there's a pile of anxiety, there's a pile of anger over here needing to be dealt with, needing to be digested, as we sometimes say in the yoga world. And so doing all of that is exhausting, and a lot of it doesn't get done. And people are starting to realize that, maybe especially the helpers realize that they need some help as well in ways they haven't before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I would. I'm certainly going to agree with that. I think that people have been, especially clergy, have been stretched in ways. we all know that clergy are already responsible for a multitude of tasks that they maybe didn't anticipate. Surprise, the plumbing, but also the tech. So I've heard from a lot of folks about just this overwhelming, like, how do we connect? What's the technology? And of course, the people we interact with are all across different skill sets or ability to access that. So there's this sense of how do I connect? How can I be available? And I think you were spot on when you said there's the emotional feedback, the empathy connection is not being felt, right? It's not feeding people's souls in that sense. You're not getting that connection or that resonance with people, and it's so you're not recharging. And the other thing I would add to this is I've heard several times people just concerned, Like, I still feel this sense of responsibility to the church. Like, are people leaving the church? How do I engage people? Am I failing? You know, and so this weight that the clergy are carrying.
Yeah, thank you, Jody. I agree with that. And, you know, even before the pandemic, what we saw with clergy health and our research with clergy was that we heard a lot, knew from clergy that, you know, they were living up to a call. I mean, they're called to serve the church. And so that means that their work is that much more deeply important to them. And so the joys feel more joyful, but the sorrows and the things that feel like a letdown to God. So it's really high stakes work for clergy and involves a lot of emotional swings in those ways. And so then add on the pandemic, it's situations where clergy often already felt fairly socially isolated. Now we all feel fairly socially isolated and beholden to our technology. And yes, this allows us to connect like we are today, but it also means it's really hard to turn off. We're always made to, clergy, especially now, are feeling they always have to be available without getting that time to recharge. And then, you know, clergy are asked to stand in spaces of incredible tension, whether it be in spaces of politics and social justice or the health crisis. You know, many clergy are that I've worked with are lamenting that, you know, they don't feel safe having in-person visits with congregants who believe that what's going on right now is not a big deal and not something to mean that you don't meet together as a church. And so they're stuck in this space of trying to care and being perceived as if they are not caring for the church. And it's incredibly stressful.
And I'll throw in there one more thing. I've seen some pretty deep sadness over not being able to make those personal connections around the sacraments. Saying prayers for the dying over the phone is not the same. I mean, that's a real stark difference. Not being able to serve communion, certainly not full communion, if at all. Not being able to really be present in person with people. And then for the clergy family, that means all of that interaction comes into the home space. A lot of it does. So while it's a missing piece for the clergy, it's an added piece for the family.
I think that bleeds out across, you know, staff or into congregations. A lot of this play out into just everyday life. You don't have to be an ordained person to be feeling the isolation, the loneliness. You know, I mean, there can be days where you know, I think I don't step outside and I go, really, I didn't go outside today. You know, it can be this. You know, we're so isolated right now, and I think so I wonder. Let's do this, and maybe the segue a little bit per second. But what are the things that we can kind of out of the box? You know, think of. What are the things that we can begin to do for self-care, and perhaps I can segue into some of the programs I know that you all are doing for that. So go ahead.
Well, I'm going to look to Jody to do some of the you know, the psychological first aid stuff really does come into play here. I can definitely throw in some ways to stay grounded. I tell you what, I'm going to hand it to Jody after I see two big areas. One is tips to stay grounded in the moment, because we're in a real unique time here where have to stay. We can't move ahead very well, but also we're having trouble staying grounded in the moment. So and then the other piece is dealing with all of those emotions. So staying grounded in the moment, there are just some real simple things like finding your centered space every day. And many of you have that practice already, but if you don't, consider what that has been in the past or what might work for you. There's even just a really quick senses check, just to sit down and think or write, what right now do I see? What right now do I hear? What right now do I taste, smell? Just to ground you in this present moment. And that can even work toward a gratitude practice that's a grounding. What right now or in the last 24 hours am I grateful for that I saw, touched, smelled, heard, tasted, just to bring you into this present moment, some kind of daily grounding practice. Yeah, and I'll jump back in, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Those are great. And that particular grounding process or practice with the senses, I do myself. So I think what I want to say first is if you're struggling, you're not alone. And you can know a lot about this. You can spend a career studying it and still be affected by what's going on. And so, I wake up in the middle of the night and with anxieties about things, and I use that particular grounding practice to help me get recentered into the moment. But I guess what I want to start with is what we're experiencing is normal for an abnormal situation. Okay, so the first thing is to understand that some of the things that you're experiencing, your family is experiencing, that the people that you're talking with are experiencing, are common reactions to a crisis. Okay, so what oftentimes people don't understand is that these are common natural responses, and we start to worry about it. So and they can be cognitive and emotional and behavioral. And so, for example, if you've noticed that you are forgetting things more, if you're having difficulty concentrating, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Okay. Actually, even being clumsy. So in March on my birthday, I fell down the stairs and gave myself a black eye. Right. So like I've been walking up and down stairs for, 50 plus years. And suddenly in the midst of all this stress, I'm finding myself being a little more clumsy. So that, there's some behavioral things going on. And the really important piece of that is to understand those things and to give yourself some space and some compassion that these, again, are common reactions to a very uncommon situation. It does not mean that we're going crazy or that there's something wrong with us or that that it's going to spiral out of control, because you have to breathe. Okay, you have to breathe into this. I actually have a little piece of paper on my desk here that just says this, and I keep it throughout the day, and I use it throughout the day to do those grounding practices and to just breathe into this moment. So I'll toss it over to Rachel and Ardell, and I don't want to hog the conversation. So.
Jody, thank you. I think it's so important to give us all permission to feel what we're feeling and to not feel the stigma that we often want to place on, especially mental illness symptoms, but to normalize that these are some things we're all experiencing. I am actually somebody who lives with generalized anxiety disorder, and when it's at its worst, I'm having panic attacks and I don't sleep and my work suffers. But when I am doing well, it's doing things that I've actually learned from working with our clergy. And for me, that is exercise. And it's being agile with that exercise. So before the pandemic, I was part of a gym where I could go box, and that was really good for my anxiety. And then my gym shut down. And so I picked up my tennis shoes and I walk every day almost now. So that gets me time outside. And yes, it's good for my physical health, but that is so much more for my personal mental health, to spend time outside, to walk. I schedule it in my calendar as time out, so that I honor that. And we've heard that from our clergy as well, that's really helpful. I loved that Ardell mentioned, the 5 senses practice. There's a lot of practices out there that are easy to do and readily available. We are currently testing some practices with clergy around stress management. One of those is the daily examine, which is a Jesuit practice. We're sort of reflecting on the past 24 hours. And you can Google that, and there's lunchtime examines that you can do in 15 minutes that are really, I think, helpful and powerful. And then the other practice that I really love is loving kindness meditation. And again, that's something you can do in 5 minutes. And I think that for clergy, especially, I love this because the loving kindness meditation typically starts with yourself. And you sort of recite to yourself, may I be well, may I be safe, may I be happy. And then you think about loved ones around you and you send that loving kindness out to them and then beyond to your community and the world. And it is a way to feel connected and grounded at a time when we are physically apart in many ways.
Great. Those are all great. Yeah, Ardell, go ahead.
I was just saying, if I can tack on to what Rachel was saying, those practices of loving kindness, I believe in the resources, there's a link to compassion cultivation website. And so what that is exactly what Rachel's talking about. Compassion being defined as the ability to be present with pain and suffering without having to run away from it, without being overwhelmed by it. And that compassion is a muscle that will atrophy if it's not exercised both with oneself and with others being others close in and others far away. And I've done that class, and other people I've talked to who've done that class. That takes some time dedication if that's where you're at. But it's really helpful. And regarding the exercise, I'm going to come back real quick to the yoga language of digesting emotions. Our bodies know much better how to take in what we need and get rid of what we don't than our minds. And moving can help do that with emotions. You can help move emotions through your body just by moving, by walking, running, kickboxing. So yeah, play with that if it's helpful to think of your moving as a way to let the emotions run through your body and to be able to take what you need from them and let the rest go, like your body does with food.
Bob, I would add that there are some things that we can stop doing or limit that are also self-care. So if you find yourself watching the news or having it on in the background all the time, we're getting a lot of strong emotion from the people around us, from the things that we're allowing into our consciousness and our subconsciousness. And whether we're paying attention to it or not, it's still coming in. And we are social beings. Whether we are attentive to it or not, we have a reaction to it, and those strong emotions can penetrate, and we can start to feel those things. And so part of it is disconnecting from the things that are keeping us in this panic or this feeling unsafe. And there's a lot of messages out there right now that are saying we're unsafe, it's going to get worse, things are horrible, and our brains respond to that and become more actually attuned to those negative messages. And we actually start looking for those things, scanning the environment for those. And so, of course, every time you're looking for something, that is what you see. And that's where those retraining our brain and like our gratefulness, just gratitude practices, loving kindness is a retraining of that brain to disengage from that scariness.
Yeah. So okay, I'm gonna jump in for a second. One is Jody, you held up that piece of paper. I couldn't read it, and I think a couple people in the chat couldn't read it. Could you read it for us and
Sure.
tell us what's on that nice little token?
Yeah, it's really brilliant, very, very complex. It says, breathe. No, really, breathe. That's all it says. But I need the reminder throughout the day.
Yeah. And for us to breathe deeply, right? And the different levels of breathing that help. I mean, that's certainly the case. Having like Ardell, my spouse is a very well-trained yoga instructor, so I hear a lot about breathing and breath work and all of that. So that's important. The other thing, I think that both I think it was Rachel and Ardell mentioned a class online. I don't see it up in the chat, and so I want to make sure that we get get what's the link? What people are asking for.
Compassion cultivation training. And sorry, I'm gonna have to reach across the room. I'll pull that up and send it to you.
Yeah, so we can get that, if we can get that posted in the chat, that'd be great. So just back into what Jody was saying, I think now is I think of it as who's renting space in your brain and your emotions without paying you rent. You know, I mean, who's just, you know, who do you have to evict? You know, what emotions, what information are you taking in that isn't productive for yourself, right? And certainly in my background of the mystics and in that area of study for myself, is that the mystics are all about that kind of discipline about what we are allowing into our life and what we're allowing to be in our body, through what we think and how we pray. And so, Rachel, I think you were going to add something there.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of right in line with that. I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago with the PI of our project, Regine Preshold Bell, and she was telling me about a practice with some research support, where it can be hard to turn off the news or turn off our worry or whatever, completely all day. So to be intentional about it and schedule time, and she said, pick from 4 to 4:30 when you're going to worry about COVID in the world, and you set a timer. And at the end of that 30 minutes, you let that go and you kind of, walk away on to the next thing. And as we were talking about it, for me, that really brought up, for those of us that are Christians, the practice of lament. We have a practice for this. And so, spend that time worrying about whatever it is you need to worry about, lamenting about it, and then pray on that and give it to God. And remember that ultimately it is God that is in charge. And trust in that provision. Go to the Psalms. We have practices for this, and so I think sometimes we just forget that those Christian practices are longstanding and exist for this time.
There's even the Great Litany. It's not necessarily thought of out of season, but it's certainly appropriate.
Yeah.
Lord have mercy. And Bob, I did pull up. If Joe was in the background, it was in an email like 10 o'clock this morning. You might be able to pull it up for the chat box. So I'm on my phone. I can't type it in there, but it's compassioninstitute.com. And the teacher that I took from was Dr. Dent Gitchell. You can see a list of teachers and where the courses are offered online. Compassioninstitute.com. It's out of Stanford. It's that's where the curriculum comes out of.
Now, each of you all of us, we're all teaching different classes, and I think are different programs, or develop different programs that I think I hope that those that are on would enjoy hearing a little bit about. So why don't we just each take a few minutes to explain, because they're important, and they'll be helpful. So, Rachel, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I've mentioned one in the Daily Examine as something that we are trying with clergy. Breathwork is another practice we're trying with clergy right now. But I think what I'd like to mention is we've done some work with clergy who are doing well, who are flourishing before the pandemic, and through interviews and daily diaries and really kind of digging into their habits. We saw 4 themes emerge among those folks. And so I look to that as like ways, things that, how you build your toolkit maybe. And so one is that these clergy were great at creating boundaries. So saying at 6 o'clock, the cell phone no longer gets answered or email doesn't get checked, keeping Sabbath and broadcasting that you're keeping Sabbath on your email signature, whatever that might be, taking vacation, being very intentional about health behaviors. So waking up an hour early, if that's the time that you're going to be able to get in some exercise, or reading scripture or prayer or whatever it is that helps you. And then also being flexible. So recognizing like, okay, it's raining today. I'm not going to get outside. Can I do a yoga video inside? But just kind of always being intentional and attentive to the things that help support your health. A big one is doing discernment work to make sure that you're working in alignment with God. I think for clergy, critical congregants can be really derailing in terms of their even their sense of calling and how they're doing. And And so it can be hard when congregants are mad at you or criticizing how it is that you're leading the church. But if you're spending time discerning the work that God is calling you to do, there is comfort in that. And to be able to, at the end of the day, set down your work, trust that God is still in charge, rest, and pick it up the next day, I think is hugely helpful for the clergy that we've learned from. And then the last thing is just making sure that you're really attentive to your social support network. So someone, whether it's a spouse or a friend or a colleague that you can share both joys and sorrows with, even small ones. And I know right now we can't travel, but when we can again, if you can plan an annual friends retreat, time where you can be who you are outside of the church especially, I think is really important to clergy. And if you can find a peer group of other clergy, maybe from different denominations, where you might have a little more anonymity if you need that, I think is also something that we've learned from our folks that has been really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, if you haven't reached out and called a friend in the last week, perhaps you need to do that. That kind of caring, just, and you can make the excuse like, hey, I want to check in on you. It's a two-way street, right? And I think there's a habit
Absolutely
of us being really shut down, but I think those are wonderful examples of self-care. So how about Jody or Adele? Would you share your programs?
I'll go ahead and go, if that's okay, Ardell. So first I want to say, Rachel, spot on. I mean, connection, we are about connection, right? And if we don't have it, we need it. I think, for a long time in the last 10 years, I've heard about the social isolation that clergy have been feeling. And in some ways, this environment where there's a lot of reaching out virtually, overcome some of those obstacles, because we've always thought about having to get together physically, right, in order to have some of those needs met. But you can, in the interim, at least establish some kinds of connections virtually, maybe that you hadn't thought of before. Mm-hmm. So I would second that, definitely. So what I've been spending a lot of time on is doing some general training, actually, on psychological first aid. And it's not just psychological first aid, which is an evidence-supported practice. It's a very basic training on how to talk to people who are in crisis or have experienced a disaster or a long-term chronic kind of crisis, or multiple crises, I might say, might be more applicable right now. But how to do that in a manner that is supportive, but not necessarily long-term. And what I really like about psychological first aid is that it addresses a lot of the patterns that we see when a community, a person, a family, a church, a country experiences a disaster. There's a pretty well-researched pattern of reactions that all of those folks have, and it allows people to address those in a really meaningful way. And it is not intended for people who are mental health providers. It's really intended for the people, your congregants, your neighbors, family members. So it's been teaching people about that. And the thing I really, really like about psychological first aid is that it's focused on helping people reconnect, whether it's people or a community, with their own resilience. And I think that's important in several different ways, because people do come to their clergy. People do come to the formal mental health system, and they're distressed, and understandably so. There, frankly, is not enough clergy or formal mental health system to be able to support everyone in this. That means it's all hands on deck. Everybody needs to be able to support each other and understand that. And there's some links in the chat there about free online training for psychological first aid. And it's just basically 8 core components, which are supporting people, practical assistance, helping them reconnect to their support systems, helping identify when people really might need some formal intervention, and things like that. But I want to stress to those on this call, you can never be all things to all people. And when we try to do those things, whether you're a psychologist or a psychotherapist or clergy or a researcher, you cannot do that. And it is a disservice to people to not encourage them to remember the ways that they've coped in the past with things that have been traumatic or crisis. Because we've all, if we're adults, we've all dealt with some of that. And that's the first thing that we forget in a crisis situation, is the ways that we've coped successfully in the past. And so it's really reconnecting people to their strengths. So I encourage people to sign up for that, or share it with everyone that they meet. So I'll leave it at that and pass it to Ardell.
It's a great course. Yeah, I've gone through it in a number of different ways. So yeah, thanks, Jody. Not enough could be said about reaching out for help and about making connections, using your support network. If you've been to a Planning for Wellness conference that I've worked, you've heard me share. It's a story I often tell. Several years ago, I ran into a health crisis completely out of the blue, as far as I knew, and unexpected. And came face to face with the reality that between my being a therapist and my spouse being a clergy, we had planted ourselves firmly as helpers, and I didn't know how to reach out for help. I didn't know who to reach out to for a pastor. I didn't call a single person, though I was in the hospital overnight suddenly. And it was just a real wake-up call to, at the time, I think also we hadn't noted that we had had a life stage change. Our kids had aged out of play groups where we got to know other parents, spent a lot of time with the other parents. So literally everywhere we were the helpers. And I didn't know how to get myself out of that. And so, yeah, for all of us, but maybe particularly those in the helping professions, can be hard to get your head around that, to reorient yourself, to think ahead about, or in the moment about, that you might need a pastor, though you are the pastor, and it might not be a clergy, because all of those are colleagues, but somebody that you look to. And for clergy spouses and clergy families, the same issue can be there. Right now, though, you might need to be looking for sources you would have never expected to. I mean, some people who never expected to need help with housing and finances, those kinds of impacts are really unexpected right now, in addition to the mental health. So yeah, reaching out. And when Bob mentioned programs, I don't know if he had in mind, I'll throw in there that I've been working for a couple years with some other people on a nationwide support organization for clergy spouses in the Episcopal Church. And we are just about to launch our first event in partnership with Bexley Seabury Seminary. So that hasn't gone out quite yet, but our website will go public within the next week. The organization is called the Partners Path. It's thepartnerspath.com.
Okay, good.
And Bexley Seabury Seminary's website should have that in their pathways. They're on their lifetime learning section as well.
I think that, thank you all. And as you can see there, you all do fascinating work. And probably the most pertinent class that I teach, I teach at General Seminary, is a class called Congregational Spiritual Direction. And it's an idea that no clergy, we don't have enough spiritual directors to go around if everybody in a congregation wanted to use a spiritual director. It's just not possible. So how do we reach out on a congregational basis, on a group basis, to develop the souls and develop the spirit of the people that are with us on a Sunday? when I was in this, I'm not serving at a church at the moment. I spent about 8 weeks with a congregation in person, and then the rest of the time virtually. At my last church, and one of the things, I think this is, I wouldn't be surprised if it's all of the. I think this is true for everyone, but particularly with the clergy, is that we went into lockdown and there was 1,000 questions that needed answers that had never been answered before or been even asked before. And they were all small little things, but each one of those is like a drop of water into a bucket that's pretty full anyways. And I think for a lot of us, I think for those in helping professions, right? You know, how do we do our work in this virtual way? And sometimes it's been wonderful. And sometimes we've gotten to be able to connect in ways that are surprising and have helped us grow. I'm teaching a Bible study with a group of people right now that I've never met across 2 denominations, and I would love to meet them all at some point. But who knows if we're ever going to do that? But that's a privilege to be able to do that. But also, it's all of the taxing things that go on once we leave home, and all the little stress that adds up. I think that burdens us in ways that I don't think that we're fully aware, that there's a spigot on at the bottom of our emotional bucket that's running out that we're not aware of. So can you each of you talk about and perhaps give some tips on what are, and I know we've touched on it, but what are some of the, particularly for the family, the clergy family, perhaps, you know, I think we've given ourselves some tools for the clergy themselves, you know, or us as individuals, but let's talk again about some ways, tips, tools that we can give folks to cope these days.
I think one is that line between work and home has kind of gone away as everyone's brought their offices into their homes, and we're all aware of that, and there are good things about it. But to try to be aware, most of you are probably working at odd times, working at times that you wouldn't have been. Your work has come into your home and your personal life. So try to also take time off at odd times where you can, and be aware of where those come up and not feel guilty about it. Before, you might not have taken a morning or an afternoon segment of time where there were no meetings, but you really, really need to do that, because you're also working at really odd times and bringing work into your personal sphere routinely, most likely. So really, try to take the odd moments the other direction as well, with no guilt.
So I'm hearing from, I think I've heard this theme throughout with the 3 of you, and I would agree with that, is the discipline of distance and boundaries, and the discipline of being careful about what we let in and when, and being able to manage our time in ways that perhaps we didn't have to worry about when we shut the door and maybe just walked across the street to our home, or we got into a car and drove back home. I think that I'm hearing that as a theme across the board. What are some of the other things we can do?
So you brought up the concept of permeability, right? How accessible are you? And I want to touch base on something that Ardell brought up about our home space. So it's about setting boundaries, right? Setting limits with people, and that goes better if you have that conversation early. Does it? But you can always take advantage of anything to say, oh, you know what, this would be a good time for this conversation. So I talk to people about that no is a complete sentence. And oftentimes you have to educate, because we teach people how to treat us, and we teach people what to expect from us. And so there's a couple of tips that I just want to share. And one is, you know, I only do work. I'm at home. I only do work at this desk in this room. I do not do work in another room. So I've set a physical boundary there. There's some delegation things that you can do by that you're not always the one that is directly accessible, that there are other people then that that people can contact. So for example, I have an agreement with my leadership that if they need me and they call, I'm not going to answer if I'm busy. But if they text me that it's, you know, an emergency, then I'll know that I need to leave. Otherwise, the agreement is I'm not going to call you back right now. So there's some certain things that you can do and delegate some things off to give yourself space, right? To have some peace, because you can sleep, but that sleep is not the same as peace.
Mhm.
Right. So you have to give yourself that spiritual and emotional place as well.
Mhm.
Rachel, you got some ideas?
Yeah. So, in a personal story, I'll just admit. So I started dating someone about 8 weeks before the pandemic hit, which meant that we had to decide very early on if we were going to be in each other's corn pod. And then a lot of communication around, you know, please don't be offended. I don't want to see you today. Or I'm going to be in the same space as you, but not really. I'm going to be over here baking or watching this silly show, or you're going to be watching, you know, hockey or, you know, whatever it is. And don't take that personally as me not wanting to spend time with you. I think we're managing a lot of one another's personal emotions in ways that we've never had to before. And it's an opportunity to communicate about our needs in ways that we really haven't before. And we're lucky that we're stronger because of it in my personal relationship, but it could have broken us early on had we not been able to recognize our own needs and then communicate them to the partner in a way that they wouldn't take whatever those needs were as a personal offense. And then just a totally separate thing that I thought about, but wanted to mention, you know, so with our research in clergy health, two of the strongest predictors of depression and anxiety are social isolation, which we've talked a lot about connection and community, and the other is financial stress. And so there are financial advisors that you can, you know, reach out to. There may be financial resources through your pension group, your denomination. So if you are in a position where you have a lot of financial stress, recognize that that is just another probably pretty large drop in the bucket. And you know, do a home scan of the things that are making you stressed. Is it your finances? Is it the messy kitchen? Is it, you know, all the toys that are out on the floor, whatever that is, and make time to work through that. It might be scary at first or overwhelming at first, but that can have a huge impact on your mental health. And so not to ignore those things.
I would say that these days, particularly as the numbers have spiraled up, you know, getting out of bed, making our bed, starting our day is an accomplishment, right? Choosing to live in the day, you know, and that's a choice. And I think for us, we can recognize that and affirm that, and that's a good thing. I'm mindful of those mystics that are that are the ones that go into the desert or go into the anchor hole, that are particularly those that have given wisdom from the isolation of their spirituality and of the way they have found God there, that these can be times of deep and profound spiritual times of spiritual growth, if and when we allow ourselves to be that. And I think part of that is for us as clergy is to say, you know what, I'm not the savior of my congregation, Jesus is. You know, it's not. I'm not the one who's carrying this congregation. Jesus is, because Jesus is carrying me now too. And to recognize that we're all in need of that salvation, and not just the salvation of, yes, I'm saved, I've been baptized, etc., but that I'm in a need of a Savior to come and to carry me through. Psalm 34 is a psalm that is a psalm of thanksgiving, but also one that goes into the depths of of despair. And I think that those things that we've talked about the Psalms being so important for us. So as we move into our last kind of phase, are there other thoughts that you have as we begin to wrap up in this last 10 minutes or so?
I was looking back over my notes of where I had, laid out some thoughts as I was thinking this through. And my one other thing, Bob, was this has been helpful for me and helpful to some people that I have met with, that in this space of it being really hard to move along a trajectory like we're used to doing, like everything just keeps being a full stop ahead at every point. So I know I mentioned, oddly enough, we're stuck in the present moment, and we also have to find ways to really be present here and not just let our anxiety and grief get the better of us. But it's been helpful for me then to set that inside. Let me back up. When I first discovered the Episcopal Church as a young adult, this notion of time not being just linear, but being circular, and setting that inside the church year, of the circle of the church year, was really helpful. And so I've come back to that. We typically in Western culture think of time on a trajectory, a linear, and there are lots of good things about that. But if I think of it, my life is in a circle, and it's set inside the circle of the church year as a Christian, or inside the story of Jesus' life, then I'm not so much stuck, so much as this is how my life is. And when I keep circling back around to the same thing, or I can't seem to get forward, that's one way of looking at time. It's here. And yes, it stacks up on top of each other as time moves on, which is still, just a human linear way of looking at it. But somehow setting this moment inside a circle is really helpful for me, rather than this linear, I can't seem to move ahead as a Christian. And, it could even be seasonal for people who are not Christians, or are not connected to the church year.
Jody, there's a couple of in the chat. There's been a reference to one of your, I guess, the psychological self-care. There's some references. Let's make sure that we have if we take a look at our chats. I think Ardell is as well. You had a question there, and as we're also want to make sure that Rachel, you've done all this work on recently on thriving and flourishing clergy. Have you published that? Is there a place that folks might be able to read some of the results of your team or yourself?
Yes, so I have sent 2 links to Joe, I think, to share out. One is to a book that my colleagues wrote and published. So this is our principal investigator and a pastor actually talking in conversation about our research. A lot of it is focused on that flourishing research, but some of our other work as well. And then also a link to an 8-page PDF that's kind of glossy and easier to digest if you're not big into research. So those 2 things are great resources.
Thanks.
I'm looking in the chat. So I had a couple of different links put in here. So both are about psychological first aid. The one through John Hopkins also has a self-care component that you can take. Those are all free. There's all sorts of self-care tips out there. I want to probably, as we wrap up, what I want to say mostly is, number one, thank you for everyone on this call, for all that you do, for all that you give, and those that give care are often the worst at self-care. So there's a quote that I love, and I wish I could remember who said it, but it is not mine. But it goes, before you were called to be a shepherd, you were called to be a lamb. And I believe that self-care is not a selfish act. And if you read a little Parker Palmer, he has a lot to say about that. And it is about taking care of ourselves so that we may care for others, but one is not, taking care of other people is, you cannot pour from an empty cup, right? So Bob, you've talked about the bucket. And I often in Credo have a slide and the question is your bucket leaking? Because, and if you've ever tried to patch a vessel from the outside with duct tape or something, it doesn't work.
Mhm.
You have to patch it from the inside. So you have to have the resources to be able to help someone else. And if you don't care for yourself, that isn't caring for other people.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think I work on in my course about if the leader, if the pastor, the priest is not in a good place themselves spiritually, they're not capable to grow the spiritual lives of others. And that works true as the staff. I mean, anybody who's overseen a church staff knows that if you've got a dysfunction in that staff, that's not, if the team isn't working well, right, then all of your energy goes to carry, to working on the team. The congregation is still coming on Sunday. What kind of care, how present are we for them? And I think that bleeds through with ourselves to our team around us, the people that work with us, and how well we've taken care of ourselves so that we can be available to growing the spiritual lives of others. I think it's absolutely critical. So yeah, take more time now for yourself, not less, even though it seems anti-intuitive, right? We've been at this for a long time now, almost a year, right? And so I think it's that stuff is really important. So other thoughts before we wrap up.
Bob, I did type in the comment section, thepartnerspath.com. I just want to say again, that is not public yet, but it should be within the next week.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Super. That's great.
Yeah, and I would just say, something that we've talked a lot about with our clergy is just a reminder that, incarnation was deeply personal. God chose to be with us in the form of God's human son. And when Jesus was resurrected, he was not resurrected with healed wounds. He was resurrected with his wounds. And so there's a Reverend Claire Wimbush that we've done some work with that, she says, God never chooses to be with us except to be with us in our brokenness. And so remember that we're all broken humans in that way, and to give some compassion and care in that. And then, the other thing that we've talked, about with our folks is that, our bodies are a gift from God, just like our gifts of service or pastoral counseling or whatever are gifts from God. And that's a gift of grace. And our call is to take care of those gifts. And so, if we are called to help, if we are called to ministry, part of answering that call is taking care of the vessel that allows us to live out that call.
Yeah,
so it is not selfish to spend some time on yourself.
Yeah. Well, the spiritual director in me can't help but leave folks with a word and really a question to ponder. And it would be this: is the question to keep with us, I think, on an everyday basis is how am I building hope in myself? And some of that answers can be is how am I letting Jesus build hope in me? And how am I allowing hope to grow? And where am I finding that hope? So some questions to ponder. We've got just a minute or two here, and to wrap up on time. But last thoughts, and if not, I'll when we're ready, I'll close with another prayer.
What was your breathe quote again, Jody? Breathe.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Breathe. No, really. Breathe.
No, really.
Really breathe. Yeah, folks. Yeah, it's that simple, but it's also that difficult. Yeah. Well, I'll end now with this prayer. The Lord be with you, and with thy spirit let us pray. O God, you lead and guide me toward the land of hope, where your light and love shine forever. Give me the confidence to feel all my emotions, even the ones that mystify or scare me. Let me not live this day without connecting to the various feelings I may have. I want to unite with all of them so I may thrive, loving each moment I'm alive. In your gracious name I pray. Amen. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being with us. And
Thank you.
Thanks again to everyone who joined the
Thank
call.
you.
We really appreciate your presence.
Yes.
I've really enjoyed getting to know you all as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.